Hello, listeners, and welcome to what is the first episode of the Jacob Shapiro podcast. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis, and not much has changed. This was the artist formerly known as Cognitive Dissidents. We didn't change anything, so you're still subscribed to us in general, but we changed the branding on the podcast, and I wanted to take a minute or two to tell you why. A couple of months ago, I received a note from a Mormon podcast saying that they had started a podcast called Cognitive Dissidents years ago, and that the trademark belonged to them. Now, I could have fought that email from that group if I wanted to, but as clever as the name Cognitive Dissidents is for a podcast, I found that it was actually difficult to market because when I would speak at events and talk about my podcast, it kind of came out as a tongue twister, and it's too close to cognitive dissonance, and it was too complicated to sort of get the word out there. Also, people would look for Jacob Shapiro and they wouldn't find anything, or maybe they would find something else rather than the podcast where I was putting out a lot of content. So I had been thinking about changing the name for a while, and that group reaching out sort of gave me the push that I needed to change it. And the other thing that happened around the same time was a cousin of mine, cousin Randy, I don't know if he's listening or not, he found an op-ed in the New York Times written by Jacob Shapiro, and he texted me and said, "Congratulations on this incredible op-ed that you had in the New York Times." The problem was cousin Randy was reading an op-ed that was written by Jacob N. Shapiro, who is a professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University, where he directs the Empirical Studies of Conflict project. And I had to tell him, well, thank you for thinking that, but honestly, it wasn't me, so I can't take the credit. This is not the first time that I have been mistaken for the Princeton version of Jacob Shapiro. I get tagged as him on social media sometimes because he's writing lots of articles and things like that in a sort of analogous space, not exactly related, but close enough that sometimes people think that we are each other. So I reached out to Jacob and said, hey, is this something that has been happening to you too? And wouldn't it be really funny if I rebranded my podcast to the Jacob Shapiro podcast, and the first episode of the Jacob Shapiro podcast featured Jacob Shapiro interviewing Jacob Shapiro, which is exactly what we're going to bring to you today. So we went up to Princeton actually a couple weeks ago. We got to record with Jacob in person at the studio at Princeton, which was really fun. And if you want to go check this out on YouTube, oftentimes our YouTube channel is just the video of my guests and I in our offices because we're recording remotely. But this one we did in person, and we got to do a little give and take. And I think the episode shows that in its quality, and the video is probably also entertaining if you want to look at it too. So I really want to say thank you to Jacob for coming on, and I hope that he will continue to come on every once in a while to the Jacob Shapiro podcast because it at least shares his name a little bit too. Ironically, there is yet another Jacob Shapiro at Princeton, and we were supposed to all get lunch together, 3 Jacob Shapiros. The universe might have broken, but unfortunately, he had something else to do and he couldn't. But apparently, there are a lot of us out there. So for all the Jacob Shapiros, you can have some small part of this podcast for yourself. And for all of our listeners, thank you for sticking with me for this long and for sticking with Cognitive Dissidents. Absolutely, nothing is going to change here except the title and the branding. And we're going to try to do more podcasts and more in-person interviews with really interesting people like my fellow Jacob Shapiro and the episode that we're doing today. So if you have any concerns, you can always email me at jacob@cognitive.investments. Nothing has changed at Cognitive. Nothing has changed in my speaking business and career. Nothing has changed in the investment services that we offer. And I'd love for all of you to reach out to me directly if you want to talk more about those things. But in the interim, I hope you enjoy this first episode of the Jacob Shapiro podcast. Take care of the people that you love. Cheers, and see you out there. Jake, it is so nice and cognitively dissonant to be here with you. Normally I'm doing this from my office in New Orleans or somewhere on the road, but we actually get to be here in person, in camera at Princeton University, which kills me as a Cornell grad, but fine, that's fine. We can be here at Princeton. Thank you so much for accepting the call from a random Jacob Shapiro online.
My pleasure. It's great to be with you and thrilled to be able to have you down here at Princeton to have this conversation.
Yeah, maybe we'll get you back down to New Orleans for next time.
Definitely.
I don't know. I wanted to start. So yesterday I was in New York and I was talking with some pretty high-powered folks. And one of the icebreakers for the dinner was to go around and say, what is the thing that is worrying you most? And I'm not kidding. The first 6 or 7 people, the first thing they said was, I'm worried about disinformation. And I'm worried about disinformation in the context of the upcoming US election. I'm worried about echo chambers and polarization and how there's this massive lack of trust in the media and we have nowhere to go for truth. And we were chatting before we actually started rolling. And you sort of talked about how, well, people have been worried about that all year. the other shoe hasn't fallen, things don't seem to be that bad. So I guess the first question I want to lob to you is, if you had been at dinner last night, what would you have said to those folks who said that was their top concern?
So I think the first thing I would have said was people had those concerns about the elections in Mexico, in the EU, in India. And for the most part, the horribles that people worried about did not come to pass. We didn't see a flood of Gen AI content that was like cleverly manipulating people and shifting them in new ways. We didn't see kind of in the EU elections like massive outperformance by parties that were obviously aligned with Russia. We didn't see in India kind of mass mobilization for violence, or the Gen AI shops that different candidates were doing leading to like massive outperformance by the BJP and kind of the far right of the Hindutva movement. So I'm worried about that too, but the evidence that's been coming in so far this year suggests that it's probably not going to be as bad as we're worried about. There are other things around the election we can talk about that I'm like super worried about, but that one I become less so with every overseas election where we're not seeing those horrible outcomes.
All right, well, so let's put a pin on the other stuff that we're going to worry about, and say, why do you think that those things didn't come to fruition? Was it an unrealistic expectation about what those things could do? Is it that the technology is not advanced enough yet, and that 3 years from now, if we continue improving at the level that we will, that the deep fakes will be good enough to do it? Like, how do you explain that lack of impact?
So I think some of it is the technology not being good enough. So like we have a project in my lab where we built a system to generate lots of images that might be used for political manipulation. Basically drawing on headlines and people and using LLMs to kind of manipulate the prompts in ways that are designed to get around safety features. And we haven't run it at scale yet, but in the pilot testing with a number of the kind of common image generation systems, we're finding it really, really, really hard to get them to create persuasive imagery. They'll create emotive imagery, but it's often full of like different artifacts and weird things. And it turns out to be very hard to get the main easy-to-use commercial systems to generate good pictures of actual people, particularly in the US where they've like focused their attention. And so I think part of it is it's just still harder than we thought. But I think the other part is a lot of the concern around disinformation and the impact of Gen AI didn't think about the consumer side of the information ecosystem. They thought about the production side and like all the crazy things the tools would let you do. But the consumers in this ecosystem, like, they have a lot of choice and a million things vying for their attention. And so for most people, choosing to pay attention to the places where the really weird and crazy disinformation stuff is getting spread, it's just like not a thing they care about, right? They care about entertainment, they care about sports, they care about lifestyle stuff. And so you have this increase of information.
Jake, while you were explaining how none of this like is going to be scary, a fire alarm went off, which was obviously the universe telling us that
we should rethink that.
You're saying something that is not quite right. Also, like, man, like where are the smart fire alarms? Like, do we really have to keep doing fire drills if AI is really going to lead us to this glittering future? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, we just need the AI sensor to like follow us out and make sure we're
okay. Or maybe the AI sensor decided that like we were, touching the truth in some meaningful way, and that this entire conversation needed to be burned down. I guess that's three-body problem, right? Like we're really
that's getting a little
on deep science.
It's getting a little dark forest.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so let's pick up where we left off. We were talking about sort of the reasons why you think that disinformation hasn't sort of affected things as much as people thought, and you started talking about the technology, but I think you were leading to something else.
Yeah, so where I was going is I think a lot of the concerns, a lot of the arguments that Gen AI was going to have a particularly supercharging effect on disinformation missed out on the consumer side of information consumption. And we all have a million different things we could be paying attention to. The device in my pocket will serve me up dozens of fascinating podcasts, none as good as this one, but like lots of others. Television, radio, YouTube, Instagram, books on tape, everything in the social. And so for me to choose to consume that information is like a very conscious choice. And so no matter how much is being produced, you have to break through on the consumption side to really move people. And I think the reality is that like all that Gen AI content creation didn't solve that question of how do you get people to pay attention to it over all the other things they're interested in. And as a result, you didn't really shift the mass conversation very much. And the thing about Gen AI content is if you're gonna move the conversation substantially from where it would have otherwise been, you have to present information that's new and novel and different. Mm-hmm. And anything that's new and novel and different and is too far from what people have seen before, lots of people are going to be suspicious of it. Or think maybe that's fake, maybe it's not true, maybe that's some fringe thing, and they're going to discount it. And so there's only so far you can move people unless you found a new way to like grab their attention. Mm-hmm. And I don't think yet the Gen AI has been helpful in solving that problem.
Yeah. The reason I reached out to you in the first place was because a cousin of mine sent me a text message in January saying, "Congrats on getting your op-ed published in the New York Times. Hey, cousin Randy, I hope you're listening." And I had to say,
"Thank you, Randy. You have good taste."
Yeah, you've got your good taste and your Jacob Shapiro's. But that article was actually fascinating because you were actually talking about how AI and what we're talking about can change the past in some ways. That maybe the major threat is not that you're going to move the needle in the conversation today, but that you can actually maybe fabricate some past that will affect the future. I don't know. Could you like break into that a little bit and explain? Because maybe that is more concerning than some of
the... So I think it is both in terms of politics and fraud. So there are a lot of ways to think about making it so that video and audio and documents produced from this moment forward are very hard to fake with generative AI. Right? Adobe and others have set up an ecosystem for content provenance that seems fairly robust, where content is watermarked at creation, the record of its creation is stored in a central way, so when anyone else who produces something that claims to be that document but has been altered, that can be found out. Mm-hmm. And at least it's like relatively easy to contest that. And that will work for imagery, it will work for documents, it will work for edits to computer code. So there's like that kind of watermarking technology works from this point forward. So if we get to the point where the Gen AI is good enough that it can create at scale persuasive fakes, there's a solution to that. Like there's a technical solution to that. But the past is still kind of wide open. And you can't go back to like, the moment of Lincoln's assassination and craft a news article that pins it on someone from the North, right? And watermark that, right? It's like, the fact of what happened then, like that's out there and it's been out there for a while. But what you can do with the tools is you can create those kind of fake newspapers, those fake pictures, and the original was not in any way recorded. Mm-hmm. And these technologies that are being built into like cameras that news organizations are using things aren't in the archives where all that past information is stored. And so one of the worries that we had that motivated that article was when you have revisionist political movements that want to tell a story about the past that's not accurate, but that favors their current policy positions. There's this massive amount of history that they could get in and use the tools to kind of rewrite, to create those images and documents that backstop a version of history that didn't actually happen. And so the call for action in that piece was to say, look, the organizations that have currently ingested basically all the readily available text humans have produced to train their LLMs, like, go through and watermark the versions of that content you have today, so that 5 years from now, when someone tries to create, a fake news article or a fake image of some historical event, you can at least say that's not the thing we recorded at the start of this era when we ingested all this content to train our models.
Mm-hmm. The watermarking technology you're talking about sounds a lot like, or at least it sounds like a perfect use case for blockchain. Is that sort of the direction you think it's going in, or is it something separate?
I think that is one of the really good uses for blockchain. Yeah. Absolutely. And you can think about that as, there are lots of processes where you might want to prove a thing happened at a particular moment in time. So like, I'm an educator, I teach classes, sometimes I give people bad grades, and we're not very far off. I mean, we're there now for those people to record me on their cell phone, mm-hmm. and then create an office hours meeting in which I say some horrible racist or sexist thing about them, if they're really unhappy with their grades. Mm-hmm. So I might like to have some recording of things that happen in my office that's privacy preserving, but picks up on enough of what happened that I can disprove claims about it. And if I can deposit that on a blockchain somewhere, it becomes very hard to persuasively pass off a fake version of what we did.
Yeah.
Now, there's a whole ecosystem of trust that you need to build up around that. But I think that's definitely somewhere we're going to need to go.
There's also, I mean, this goes back though to people consuming. So you need people to consume the proof rather than the reputational damage that comes from the thing that has already like formed their mental view, right? Like, do you have enough faith in the consumer that they will respond to the blockchain watermark that you're not the racist pig that the person accused you of being?
Well, so I think it depends like what population you're interested in. So if I were like a political personality and I were worried about how some fringe thought about me, I'm kind of screwed already. Because like you can deceptively edit videos of President Biden, like, you know, turning to say hello to someone to make it look like they were wandering off, and then that becomes like a conversation people are having about how the president's losing it. So we don't need deepfake technology for that. The audience that I would be worried about in the example of like the fake video audio of me in a classroom context, or think about a corporate leader where there's some creation that is seen to create risk among investors for their enterprise, is actually an audience that cares about proof. So here it would be the administration that has to decide whether to fire me or not. In the corporate case, it would be the investors who have to decide to give credence or not to the video of the CEO or the COO or probably the CFO doing something irresponsible. And that audience does care because they don't want to be screwed out of an investment either, like a profitable investment, or the university doesn't want to falsely fire someone. And so those different populations, like the protection against false claims with Gen AI is very useful for some of those use cases.
Yeah, I mean, you can already sort of think of how that gets mapped onto like geopolitics though. Like what if Venezuela creates some sort of, you know, fake about Guyana invading them first, and they use that as, you know, all they need is a day or two of confusion, or maybe to get their population to go along with it, or to make people doubt ever so slightly that something else is going on. I mean, is that more of a real concern, you think?
Well, so I don't think it is as much of a concern, or at least I should say, it's definitely a concern, but it seems unlikely to be realized because there's this tension between the secrecy you need to carry out the operation and the ability to have your institutions generate high quality fake content. And you saw that in the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. The kind of, the AstroTurf videos they created and the attempts to run false flag operations showing like, you know, Ukrainian separatists car bombing Russians, or Ukrainians attacking a chemical storage facility to try and unleash the chlorine on the unsuspecting people of Luhansk, were almost immediately debunked by Bellingcat and others through the sophisticated technique, sorry about that, of you know, looking at the metadata on the video. Like, there's no fancy forensics. It was like the Russians who were creating some of that stuff didn't even get in and edit the date on the audio track to be after like the date that the thing was claimed to have happened. Now, this was the most important foreign policy action that Russia has taken probably since the fall of the Soviet Union. And this is the state that is understood to be the best at propaganda of any state in the world. And they flubbed it, like badly. And that gives me a lot of hope. Because, you know, if you think about why they would have flubbed it, the natural thing to think about is, well, they had to keep it very secret. And so they couldn't put a lot of their best people on it, because that then would have created a signal that US or European intelligence would have picked up on, and that would have blown the operation. But if Russia can't even do it, then my concern that Venezuela is going to be able to do something big enough and fancy enough that they can like properly wag the dog is like very small.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of in keeping with the entire character of the Russian invasion. All of it was sort of
I'm just going to turn this off.
Oh yeah, because it might be another Jacob Shapiro calling. He's watching you.
It could be. But yes, you were saying that's of a piece with the Russian invasion.
Well, yeah, I mean, the entire thing was sort of amateur hour. They're only just now showing the ability to do the things we thought that a combined, you know, Russian military operation could do. It seems to me that China's the one that maybe has the real skill here, but I also don't know, like, what are they going to do? They're not going to convince the Taiwanese that, something is going to happen there. So
right, or convince the rest of the world that Taiwan was taking aggressive action against China. Like, no one's going to believe that.
right.
So I do think there are these constraints that come from like the organizational side and from the ways in which people consume information, which mean that these revolutions in how you create content are not creating the revolutions in influence that we were most worried about.
Yeah, and it's funny, at that dinner that I alluded to last night, one of the people talked specifically about echo chambers, and when I was reading through some of your stuff, I saw, like, sort of in bright lines, it was like, we don't actually have the data that social media is creating the echo chambers that everybody's scared about. Like, people have always gravitated toward the things that they agree with. Is that a right sort of characterization of your position, or am I overstating it?
Well, so I think that's right, and I think it's also right that we don't, when people have done really systematic work to try and look for echo chambers, and there's a lot of great work of this out of the CSMAP lab at NYU, they're not there, or to the extent that they're there, it's a very mild partisan bias. And some of this comes from, like, the scary stories about echo chambers were based on feeding, like, YouTube's recommender algorithm completely unrealistic behavior. And when you interact with the system in the way most people do, you don't get those kind of big swings into, like, really crazy content. You get them when you set up a robot that just automatically clicks through video after video or selects on certain keywords. And even there's like, there's this piece recently, this study recently that got a lot of attention. Saw an article on it in Forbes that said, look, like, the OpenAI chatbots are pushing people towards right-wing content in the US. But the seed terms they used were topics that are primarily of interest to people on the political right. And so the chatbot wasn't taking people who were neutral and feeding them content from one party to the other. The chatbot was taking people who expressed an interest that has a clear partisan slant to it and giving them more content with a partisan slant.
Yeah.
That's not bias in the sense of, like, trying to move people one way or the other. It's like feeding people what you could reasonably infer they're interested in based on what they've chosen already.
Yeah.
And so I don't know that we should be worried about that in quite the same way.
Yeah. I was hunting for data to sort of back up some of the things that you're saying beforehand. One of the most interesting things I found, so one of the articles that I pulled from you was written a couple of years ago, so I think the data was 2016 to 2019 or something like that. But since then, the sort of share of people, and this is Pew, I think we'll put it in we'll put the graphic up, but the number or the percentage of people who are getting their news from social media has actually declined. It's gone from something like, I have the numbers right here, so sometimes has gone up from 30 to 33%, but the people who were getting all of their information from social media, 23 to 17. So, like, a pretty sharp decline there. But the one platform that wasn't true of was TikTok.
Right.
The place, people getting their news from TikTok went from 22% to 43%. That's of the people who are getting their news on social media.
Right.
Is there something special about the TikTok cocktail that is particularly dangerous? I mean, this is a big buzz thing now in the United States because it gets into US-China competition. Is there something unique about TikTok to be worried about, or is it just the fad?
So I think we don't know, and the reason we don't know is kind of another bugbear of mine right now, which is that, like, we haven't set up the instrumentation of the information environment that we should have to understand how it's evolving and changing and how what people are seeing is evolving and changing. So TikTok is kind of uniquely non-transparent from the outside because everyone gets a very customized feed. It's customized based on an algorithm that no one outside of TikTok has access to. So we don't even know what features it's using to decide what videos to you. There's this huge amount of content created worldwide on it, and you can't even capture, we don't even have an ability to measure, like, what is being produced worldwide, because the way the company's APIs are set up don't enable that, and no one's set up the kind of research institutions to try and track it. So we fundamentally don't know. And seems like we should. There's some worrying stuff, like this wonderful report out of the Network Contagion Research Institute that looks at, like, hashtag ratios on Instagram and TikTok and shows that the kind of critical of China hashtags are weirdly low as a share of all hashtags on TikTok relative to Instagram. Now, that's, like, a really clever way to cut at the problem, and, like, huge props to Joel and team for doing that. whether that is the company proactively trying to not annoy a jurisdiction they need to be favorable to them, or some kind of direction, hard to know. But like, how much that is then moving people, we don't know. Which people are getting that different feed, like what kinds of interest people have expressed on the platform that gets them that, we don't know. So it's fundamentally just kind of like this huge unknown. And that merits a lot more study and investment, because if it is the place that, so if it's 17%, I think you said, and 43% of those, that's, like roughly 7 or 8% of the US public gets a lot of their information from TikTok. We should have a sense of how it's moving.
Is that unknown quotient enough to justify, you think, some of the sort of, I would call them strident or thuggish US policies towards TikTok? Or do you think it's like we don't understand it and it's being used for these political purposes?
So it's a good question. I mean, my concern, my personal concern with TikTok from like the national security side is much more about the kind of lack of transparency on how the information is being used, and on its potential applications as an intelligence collection tool, than the content that's being served up, in a sense that China or some other countries can be able to use it to like move US political opinion in big ways.
Yeah, probably like US TikTok content could move China, I would think, in a greater way than maybe Chinese content could use the US. Does that make sense?
I think it does. And I mean, certainly if we think about like the great influence operations in the world today that are moving many countries towards like one other country's vision of what is like the way society should be organized. Like everything is a pale, pale shadow of Hollywood.
Yeah.
And so like, this TikTok thing is like very cute compared to like Universal Studios, Disney, like these are the things that are potentially moving world culture in some sense.
Yeah. So maybe sort of pivoting from there and getting into the things that are worrying you, either about this election cycle or just the concept of mental health in a social media age, because it seems to me that one of the things that is happening is, and I can only speak about an American context, but we do have teens or young folks or even older folks who are going on Instagram and looking at things, and they find a video that says, oh, if your baby sleeps on its hands, it's cold and you're doing a terrible job in setting the thermometer right. So make sure that you turn up the thermometer, all these like different pieces of advice. And I'm even guilty of it because I like looking for the silly, funny videos. But then you get some of that stuff and you stop for a second, you're like, oh my God, am I killing my 2-year-old because it's too cold because she's on her hands in the app. Maybe I need to be serving her, beets because she needs more iron, blah, blah, blah. That's a silly thing, but to extrapolate that to teens seeing this idealized view of what their lives are supposed to be like, and then their lives are not like that, and then they're sad about that, and then they spend more time on social media looking at how great everybody else's lives are, even though that's for sort of false consumption. Is that one of the big concerns, or do you want to take it in a different direction?
Yeah, so I think that is a big concern of like a few things that that I think we know. Like one is those kinds of idealized versions were like always available to people. Like, when I'm old enough to remember a magazine called like Tiger Beat, that was like, the idealized like TikTok version of teen life when I was growing up. But like, that ability to immerse yourself in an idealized version of what things should look like and then feel bad because your life doesn't compare, that's always been there. The question is, are these environments like uniquely salient? And if they are, for whom? And here, I have been looking into this some lately because of work my group's doing with the Princeton Precision Health Initiative to try and dig in on just this question. And what I think we know so far is that in the US and Europe, there's a clear relationship between the introduction of social media and access to smartphones and bad mental health outcomes for people who are already susceptible, either because there were already problems in the household or because they already had some symptoms of depression. So the average effects, if any, are tiny, but the effects on vulnerable populations seem to be meaningful and significant in the US and the EU of the initial introduction. that doesn't tell us a lot about what would happen now if we changed major features of the platforms. Because at the time of introduction, it was like this whole new way of interacting, but most of social life happened in the real world. Now we're in a place where most of social life happens in this online environment. And if we remove people from that, it could well be that it's the like shifting of where you go away from where everyone else is that's the problem for those populations, not that it's online or algorithmically mediated. And this is another instance where the reason we don't know enough is we haven't invested in the research infrastructure to measure these environments, see what's changing, see at scale how people's consumptions are changing, and then match that up with the kind of outcomes that we care about. So for mental health, depression rates, prescription rates for antidepressants, rates of self-harm, things like that, haven't been matched up in a really good way with changes in platform features or affordances, so that we can start to build out a much richer picture of the mental health consequences. So that's one set of things. The other is that there's a really nice piece, I think it was by David Graham in The Atlantic on this just this week. These effects seem to be concentrated in the US and in English-speaking parts of the world. And so now, it's not the most systematic research, so we want to be really careful here, but at least to the extent that the picture painted there is correct, it may be that what we have is some interaction of things that are going on in the US and English-speaking countries and social media, and not a fundamental feature of social media and how it's shaping interactions for everyone else.
That's interesting. And I mean, this also we're going to get a little meta here, because I mean, part of the point of this podcast was that I couldn't find objective content about geopolitics at all, and everything was sort of up for grabs and you couldn't trust anything, and I wanted people to have a trusted source for these sorts of things. And I hear you in that maybe these things aren't posing as big of a challenge as they are. But also in your work, you've talked about the decline of the American newsroom, and it's gotten even worse since when you were writing about this, even 5-7 years ago. Like, we've gone from, roughly 365,000 people working in the newsroom down to 100,000, and people closing foreign bureaus abroad, or their bureaus are just one person who's, chain smoking and trying to figure everything out in that foreign bureau. So it sounds to me like what you're saying is that the coverage of this really goes to the extremes. It's, the far right, yes, it's going to activate them, but they were already going to be activated. Right. The people who are going to be susceptible to the stuff on social media, well, it's the people who are already susceptible. There is this sort of giant blob in the middle that maybe is going to go back to trusted sources. But the question I wanted to pose to you there is, are the trusted sources going to last that long? Or are they even still there? Has the decentralization termite sort of eaten away at them so that by the time we get back to those trusted zones, they're not there? Or is that too much? Do you think we can rebuild those structures as demand for them starts to increase?
So I think it's a great question. This is we talked a little bit early on about Gen AI, and one of the deep concerns I have is that they're going to eviscerate the current economic model that sustains a still vibrant, although much reduced, journalistic ecosystem, and that's going to be very hard to rebuild. So I do worry about that a lot. What the research suggests happens when the local news goes away seems to be that people don't shift into really low quality news sources. We should have a paper on this that's under review now. They don't shift into not consuming news. What they do is they move to national news. And they move mostly to reasonably high quality national news. Now that has pernicious effects in terms of nationalizing politics and making it harder to come to consensus, and there's lots of concerns about that. But it suggests there is a significant demand for news. If there's one thing we know about capitalism, it's that people will find ways to generate money from that demand. And so I think the question is do we need to think about subsidizing or finding other ways to help the news industry make it through this period where their economic model is getting broken by Gen AI and maybe some of the companies trying to repackage their content in ways that reduce their revenue and don't pay them appropriately, or that further concentrate the industry in a few superstar organizations. Do we need to provide some support to get through that period to the figuring out of new economic models that will let that demand and interest in news sustain functional organizations?
Yeah, that's a slippery slope, because who gets the funding and the support, and what is it tied to? I mean, the economic model they're going to now is, like if we go to the extremes, people will click on the extremes. We'll ignore the boring centrist candidate because we've got two 80-year-olds who both in their own ways like have crazy things about them. Let's focus on those really crazy things. Like, I don't know how it seems hard to light a way through that darkness in any meaningful way.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting challenges to think about is, one way to think about the internet is you've created this wonderful mechanism for monetizing creativity. And some of the creativity that gets monetized is, fact-free content about politics, about public health, about physical health, about nutrition. It's not clear how you set up the ability to monetize activities like the one we're undertaking today without also enabling that stuff. And there's a lot of benefit to this kind of discourse being possible, and for people being able to find the kind of bespoke content we're creating. So I haven't been able to think about a way that you structure an economic model for the internet that doesn't enable people to monetize low quality content. But that's where the consumer choices give me some hope, because people have a lot of agency about what to select into. And not everyone cares about kind of truth and good information, understanding what's happening in the world. But a significant portion of people do.
I think that's true. I was looking at some, I think it was Gallup. It was either Gallup or Pew, but they were asking what political party the normal American identified with. And it was shocking. Like, I think it was 27% identified as Republican and 27% identified as Democrat. And then over the last 15 years, like, the people who identified as neither was up and to the right and was continuing forward. And I've been showing that in some of my presentations recently to say, I know everything feels bad, but like Nixon's silent majority, it's still there. It's sitting there waiting for someone to talk to them. And maybe the media ecosystem and the system is not serving up the person that has the right combination of charisma and cred to get there. But if you do sort of scratch beneath the surface, like, it does seem like people actually agree on some of the big issues, even if we're fighting with each other like we don't agree at all.
Yeah, I mean, like abortion, gun control. There are a lot of areas where there's like a solid middle that in this country. One reading of the political science literature on polarization is that it's the politicians who have really polarized most dramatically. It's not the population. And that's a function of primary systems and low voter turnout in primaries, which means primaries favor the extremes. And so it's just very hard for centrists to get to the general election stage on both the left and the right in US politics. And so then you have people who kind of get their shot in the general because they're further away from the center. And then you've had this geographic sorting in the US that then makes it, reduces the number of places where they actually have to compete by going back to the center. And so the primary electorate is the thing. And so there's some sense in which, like, the open primary system and not having the smoke-filled room that selects the candidates who can do well in a competitive general election anymore is driving the politicians apart. And so that creates the impression of a highly polarized political environment when, as you say, most people are, kind of fairly middle of the road.
Yeah, but I am sort of, I mean, the thing you said about this being in English-speaking countries is sort of ringing in my ears. I mean, are these things we can't apply to other countries or other contexts in general right now? I mean, like, think about Mexico. We've had Mexico and India this year. Turkey's a great example last year. Examples of elections that are democratic. And the media does not seem to be able to make sense of beyond saying, it's the rise of liberal autocrats and the bad guys are winning, and sort of that whole vein of conversation, which doesn't feel right to me. I don't know if it feels right to you.
What doesn't feel right to me, particularly if you look at what happened in India this year, right? There was a tremendous amount of concern that the BJP had a very sophisticated media operation. There were tons of use of Gen AI in Indian elections, and that was going to lead them to kind of significantly outperform, no longer need coalition partners, no longer need to work with other parties. And India was going to kind of move further towards this particular kind of version of right-wing politics that has been prevalent there. And the opposite happened. Right? The voters responded in a very different way. And so, performance matters. The performative aspects of politics, I think, only get people so far.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's Emmanuel Macron's bet in France right now, too. Like, can he square up the far right and sort of the Looney Tunes and an actual sort of head-on debate, and we're no longer in the echo chamber, for lack of a better word.
Yes.
I didn't prep you for this question, so if you don't have anything on it, that's fine. But one of the, and maybe they would take offense at me saying this, but one of the English-speaking countries that does not seem to have polarization is Ireland. And I've been trying to figure out why. I mean, look at the UK, look at the US, look at us. I mean, there's a lot of political polarization there. But Ireland is just sort of, like, they have their right and left, but the extremes are way smaller. Have you ever thought about that, or do you have any explanation?
No, I mean, the only stuff I know about Ireland is, the Troubles and the history of, the conflict in Northern Ireland and Ireland's role in that.
Okay, well, maybe a topic for further interest, because their right and left seems to be much closer to each other than sort of the right and left as it is in the United States. Let's go back to what we put a pin in at the beginning. What are you worried about in the U.S. election or in general when it comes to these things?
So in the U.S. election, the big thing I'm worried about is staffing. And that's because the work environment for state and local election officials is horrible right now. One of the groups that support here at Princeton, the Bridging Divides Initiative, has done amazing work getting out and surveying local officials all around the country and doing interviews with dozens of officials all around the country. And they are under tremendous pressure from all sides around many different issues, but particularly around how elections are administered. And the share of state and local election officials who are being threatened and harassed is absurdly high. And this is volunteers. This is people who are not that well paid. These are career civil servants who view their job as running clean elections. And they're getting hammered right now. And they're not compensated. There aren't funds in most states to provide physical protection for them. They don't have monitoring services that might help sort out what are the real threats from what are the kind of fake ones. And that's a horrible work environment. Hopefully, like 22, we won't see the threats realized. But we're already seeing big staffing challenges all around the country because people who might be civically minded look at it, like, you know what, I'm going to be on like the local school board instead. And even that is like very difficult right now. But the state and local election officials are in a terrible place. And we haven't mustered the political will in Congress that I am aware of to get out and devote funds to supporting them. And that's the thing I'm most worried about.
Well, we should just say that the Chinese are after them, and then maybe the political will in Congress
that might be the move.
Well, you heard it here first. That's really concerning. And I mean, that seems to me to cut against some of what you were saying, which is, could you get something on social media, some kind of fake that shows like something happening, or depicting something fraudulent happening at a voter center in a key swing state, and get a bunch of angry people with pitchforks, for lack of a better image?
Yeah, so this is like a very worrisome prospect for sure, and that's not the disinformation moving the mass of the electorate towards one candidate or the other. That's motivating some people on the extremes to take it to the next level. And that's a worrisome possibility. And if I think about the scenarios I worry about for foreign interference in the election, it's not the October surprise against former President Trump or against President Biden. It is seeking to create chaos by going after particular officials and trying to rile up action against them.
Do you think the center is strong enough to hold against that?
Yes, so this is why I said it's like I worry about it from the staffing perspective. I mean, I'm very worried for the individual election officials and that harm will come to some of them. But I don't think that's a systemic risk in the sense of being able to motivate people in a really large number of places to take violent action. I'm not worried about that. But what I'm worried about is the quality of election administration goes down, because the fear of that makes untenable our current staffing model, which relies heavily on volunteers and career civil servants. Right? We don't have budgets to run elections that are commensurate with what you need to compensate people to be willing to take the hate and discontent they're going to get on social and through phone calls and letters to their offices and whatnot right now.
Where do you think that hate and discontent is coming from?
Oh, I think the arguments that have been made over the last 3-4 years around the 2020 election have taken what was a heated environment for election officials going into 2020 and just turned it up to 11. And, you see analogs of that on other issues on the other side of politics, but the concern for state and local election officials, I think, is really about this narrative that's been created that we can't rely on them, that they're biased, that they're not out there trying to run nonpartisan elections, but that they're somehow trying to put one over on one side or the other. And that's just kind of created, and that, the scale of that has, it's hard to argue it's increased. It hasn't increased over the last few years.
Okay, so not everything optimistic.
No, not everything, but like some of the big things. I think on the big things we tend to discount equilibrium reaction. And so with Gen AI, we're discounting the ability of consumers to adapt. With the concerns about the media ecosystem, yes, there's been this reduction, but we shouldn't discount the ability of news organizations and entrepreneurs to adapt and overcome and create new models, new revenue models. But yeah, this one is pretty worrying.
One of sort of the last big tent topics that I wanted to talk to you about, and this is from your book, was about intrastate versus interstate conflict.
Yes.
And that book was written before Russia invaded Ukraine, where now interstate conflict, I think, is occupying the imagination for people a lot more, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, China, Taiwan. But one of the sort of really cutting points you made there was that if you look at the last 50, 75 years, it's all been intrastate conflict. Most of the US conflicts abroad have been intrastate conflicts, and now I think people are even considering, are we going to have intrastate conflicts at home? If you take decentralization to its end, like, are we going to have AI systems and 3D printing where, people are going to create their own communes off the grid, and they're not going to have to interact with everybody, and everything is going to be, that dystopian reality that sometimes people are throwing around. I wanted to give you a chance to sort of update where you think we are based on that research that you did.
I mean, so a couple of thoughts. One is, if you think about how the current era of great power competition is likely to play out, unless China has come to the conclusion that Russia's engagement in supporting different parties around the world during the Cold War was not a good use of resources and was counterproductive, it's very likely this era of great power competition will involve a fair amount of irregular warfare around the world, and that will mostly play out in terms of what look like intrastate conflicts. Many of the worst intrastate conflicts during the Cold War would not have been nearly so bad had you not had external powers supporting both sides. Right? That flow of financing made it harder to settle them. It made the wars more intense, let them drag on for decades in some cases. So we should anticipate a continuation of that, unless China has come to a very different interpretation of that history and said, okay, that was a mistake by Russia. Like, that's not going to be one of the ways in which we compete with the U.S. And that's possible. And also that the U.S. exercises some forbearance and says that's not a way we're going to compete with China. I think in the U.S., I'm not so concerned about that eventuality because the dependence, like the efficiency of shared infrastructure is just so great that you can maybe live in a decentralized way now that's better than you could have 20 years ago. And in 15 or 20 years, maybe it'll be a step better still. It's still going to be much less efficient, and you're still going to rely on outside resources. So, it doesn't matter how many 3D printers you have. Someone needs to bring you the stuff to go in the printers. And you need large centralized organizations to produce that efficiently and to bring in the resources from overseas to run those and to maintain the infrastructure over which that moves. And so there's only so far you can go in that direction before it becomes radically inefficient compared to the alternative.
Yeah. Even in the China example, though, I mean, let's assume that China does reach that conclusion. I mean, it seems like countries like Russia and Iran and Venezuela are able to do enough to distract the United States already. And another thing that really stood out in that research was that you had this great example of if we built one less C-17,
right.
For that 300 million, how many commercial foreign officers could we put in Africa? How many foreign service people could we have trained in languages? I mean, it was like a brilliant point, and yet I don't see really any changed there. Like think about the recent outbreak of hostilities between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip. The first thing the United States does, 2 aircraft carriers go to the Persian Gulf, and we're spending all these millions of dollars on anti-missile defense, on drones that probably, or on rockets that cost a couple $100. Like it doesn't feel like the system is learning anything, and it looks like the United States is trying to find interstate war everywhere, and everywhere it finds intrastate war, and it just keeps on hammering the square peg in the round hole. So tell me why I should be more optimistic that we're going to see a change here.
Well, so to be clear, like I think it's not likely that China makes that decision. So I think you are going to see more intrastate conflict than we have seen for the last 30 years in the next 30, just as we did during the Cold War. So it's kind of general expectation. But if you want to think about why, why the U.S. is still, why our institutions are still focused on preparing for conflict with peer competitors, you can think about that, I think, a couple different ways. One is you can think about it as a very reasonable risk-return trade-off. You're going to take some risk in your ability to perform in irregular contexts in exchange for avoiding the tail risk of doing poorly in a conflict against a peer competitor, because the consequences of that are so much graver. And so that's like a very straightforward one. And it turns out that the resources and tools that you build for fighting a peer competitor can be applied in irregular conflicts. I think we learned that in Iraq and Afghanistan. Maybe they're not, you take some risk in doing that because you're not as good when you jump in and you have to relearn some skills and ways of operating. But it's like a reasonable trade-off. The other way to think about it is that we don't have the structures within our national security establishment that let you think about these trade-offs in a coherent way anywhere except for like the top levels of the National Security Council and like deputies and principals committees meetings. And so if you wanted to make that trade between money for FSOs and money for a C-17, which we used in that article, that there's nowhere to adjudicate that short of budget requests and trade-offs between more or less the whole Defense Department and more or less the whole State Department budget. And that's just not the thing that's going to rise to the top in that conversation. And so we don't have the structures to think about these trade-offs in a really coherent way. And then you have the congressional side. So C-17 is, this renowned example of the U.S. military saying, okay, we got enough of these things. And Congress saying, no, we think you need more. Because it's a wonderful procurement program, puts jobs in many, many states. And so we've got a whole set of institutional problems that kind of, institutional structures that push us naturally towards preparing for a certain kind of conflict. And so that's like the slightly more nefarious way to interpret the investment.
One of the articles you sent me as I was prepping was about whether Chinese Belt and Road influence is actually creating, currency from an information standpoint in some of these countries. And your conclusion in the end was basically not. But it sort of occurs to me that if the United States is going into this great power competition with China, that for China, they can have their cake and eat it too. They can have the 1,000 foreign officers, and then they can also build the C-117s or whatever it is, and like if the top decides that that's what they want to do, they can do it. And China's been relatively heavy-handed with this, like some of the things they've done in Central Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, Pakistan, like they're getting a lot of blowback, but they're also learning, and they're also in the game in a way that the United States is not really in the game. Russia here to a lesser extent. All of which is leading up to the question of every single peer competitor the United States has ever faced, just sort of on a material basis. The United States was more populous, more powerful, had greater human capital. You sort of run down the list. That's not true of China. It's sort of the first bully at the playground that the United States is dealing with that in some meaningful ways, especially population and human capital right now, can outdo the United States. Does that worry you?
So I think with it's worth thinking about this from, I think, a couple different angles. One is why isn't China getting more influence for its actions? And here, I mentioned in the information environment we weren't thinking enough about the consumers. There we're not thinking enough about the agency of the recipient states. And our research suggests a couple things. One is that politicians within those states aren't getting moved that much by BRI. The other is that the bureaucrats and elected officials in those states are very, very smart people. Right? They rose to the top of their political systems, which means they're like on the ball, just as our politicians are. And in at least the interviews that some folks in my group have been conducting, they are viewing this as an opportunity to get financing for projects that they would like to do that aren't necessarily attractive to international capital, but they believe in and think should get done. Mm-hmm. And there's now a willing provider of finance and investment for those things. Mm-hmm. And so they're going to jump on it. And they're going to move their policies and procedures to be able to sell to that funder and get their investment, not because they want to be like China or have some feel like long-run simpatico with their system, because they have development goals, and this is like a mechanism to realize those. And so a lot of the things that look, if you don't grant them that agency, like China winning a ton of influence, look very, very different. Mm-hmm. It looks a lot like China's balance of payments imbalance, that means they need to have a ton of capital they need to deploy, is being used to subsidize development all around the world. Mm-hmm. And evidence is very strong that as populations get wealthier, they become more supportive of democracy, they care more about the environment, they tend to become more liberal. So there's a sense in which like China is subsidizing its own opposition with BRI and other programs. Mm-hmm. And so you have to think about like, what's your theory of the recipient countries before you can come to a conclusion about what the outcome is. So, but in terms of the competition, I think you're exactly right. And then the question is, do we think that mass mustered through their political system will be an effective competitor? Mm-hmm. Here I've probably been like totally unduly influenced by I.N.M. Banks's culture novels. Mm-hmm. But the basic story of all those is there's some like terrible autocrat that looks super powerful, and they're going to put one over on the like soft democracy. And then it turns out when the democracy is roused, like they win very easily. Yeah. And the historical analog to this that I really just go back to again and again is Spain versus England in the 1700s. And by all accounts, Spain and then later France should have dominated that competition. Mm-hmm. They were wealthier, they had bigger populations. But the thing England could do that neither of them could is it could borrow at low interest rates, because its governing system constrained the government, and so capital was willing to go there. Mm-hmm. And that let them buy resources and people, and that was kind of decisive in those competitions. And all the strengths that you might think in terms of China being able to make these allocations or really strategically direct investment, those are vulnerabilities from the perspective of capital.
Yeah. We had Dale Copeland on the podcast recently. I don't know.
Oh, he's fantastic.
He is fantastic. And actually, we didn't get to in the podcast where he, because we ended up getting sidetracked on Elbridge Colby and him just like going off on Elbridge. But anyway, the thing I wanted to talk to him about was about his really provocative comparison of Xi Jinping to Louis XIV, and of China to France, and like why France didn't ascend to global imperial status and why England did. So it's well put there. Let me just take that question from another angle, though, because I don't know if this is happening in your circles, but at least I keep on getting questions about Bukele down in El Salvador so much. And for a while, I just thought he was sort of an oddity in and of himself. But, one of Argentina's ministers went up there to view what he was doing. Honduras came out this week. They're implementing some El Salvador-inspired security plan. Tucker Carlson, played the role of useful idiot and went down there and interviewed him and made him, seem like this sort of benevolent force at the top of things. I'm bringing that up because Mexico is an example of a country that got richer, and people don't like democracy more. It actually, people feel like it hasn't performed from them. And if you start playing with that cocktail of young democracies that don't trust the system, that have narco-violence, that are dealing with all these sorts of things. So like, let's forget about the China top-down model. Is there a bottoms-up Bukele model that scares us more, where people might start to embrace that, and those types of leaders are happier in an ecosystem where it's just transactional with China versus our ideological things?
I think it's a great question, and I don't know enough of the history of countries that have gone through these kind of episodes of intense lawlessness, kind of a political consensus around a crackdown, and then how many of them return to the democratic path versus moving on to an autocratic path for some period of time. It's certainly worrisome, but it's also the case that the trajectory those countries were on was, not sustainable. Yeah. I mean, I looked at this in 2010. One of the worst years of the war in Afghanistan. Kandahar, which was the most violent city in Afghanistan in that year, would have been the 10th most violent city in Mexico on a per capita basis. So, these countries were facing levels of violence through crime, Salvador was the same, that were really just like untenable. And, it's not clear how you get out of that without things like what Bukele is doing. And then I think the question for US policy is like, what do you do to help them get back on the democratic path and make sure they don't go down the autocratic path forever? I'm old enough to remember when people were extremely enthusiastic about Yoweri Museveni in Uganda. Right? He was seen as like the technocratic shining light. He'd won the war through a mass movement, and that meant he was cared about legitimacy and was going to be a better governor. And, was just never willing to give up power. And then the country ended up in a much darker place. Not as dark as it was during the Civil War, but not where anyone expected it to go in 2005 and 6. And I don't know, and this would be a great subject for research, like what external powers can do to encourage, like once you've gotten things under control, the movement towards, democracy and liberalism as opposed to, endless autocracy.
Or if they even can. I'm reminded of the great Robert Caro quote that power doesn't corrupt, it reveals. And I think it's revealing some of these things with Bukele and others. Last question to get you out of here on, and it's has nothing to do with what we just talked about. When we were having coffee beforehand, you mentioned that you got to give the commencement address at your son's high school graduation.
I did. That was great fun.
What did you tell them?
Oh, gosh. So what I told them was basically 3 principles for being effective at engaging in today's, kind of highly contested political environment, particularly on university campuses, where, people are primed for debate and criticism. And so the first principle I talked about was seeking diversity. Surround yourself with people who think differently than you do, who have different political views, come from different places. Try and do things you haven't done before, because that's going to equip you to understand and engage and work with people. Be radically objective. Understand the faults in your own argument and those of others, and be willing to acknowledge where things you might believe in deeply, if viewed from another lens, are problematic. And then be empathetic. And empathy doesn't mean sympathy. It means, in the context of my remarks, getting out and trying to understand why people take the position they do. What are the incentives? What are the conditions of life they live in? Put yourself in their shoes. And if you can do those 3 things, you'll develop a fantastic toolkit for going out and winning the arguments in favor of the position you believe in. Because you can't persuade people unless you understand what matters to them and where they're coming from, and how to frame the things you care about in terms that will also resonate with them. And so it wasn't a plea for like empathy and objectivity necessarily for their own sake, and diversity. I think those are all great things in their own right. But it was like instrumentally, if you want to get on campus and be able to win arguments and move people, you got to have these 3 things.
Yeah. I think that's as great a way to close as any. So I don't think the universe will collapse with you, Jacob Shapiro, is talking on the podcast, but we'll see. We'll put it out, and maybe it'll be Y2K,
I'm just glad we couldn't get the 3rd Jacob Shapiro on campus.
Yeah, well, next time, I mean, apparently it's 4, I didn't actually tell you this. Years ago, I used to play beach volleyball in this pickup group, and somebody put my email address into the thing, and they spelled my email address wrong. Right. So it went to a Jacob Shapiro in Chicago, who was on our volleyball list then for 2 years. I felt bad for him, because every Saturday it was like, hey, and he'd be like, guys, wrong Jacob, please take me off this list. And but yeah, apparently there's a lot of us out there. So
awesome. Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak to us. It was great.
Cheers. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.